There we are. We are live. Oh, hang on. We should be. Hang on. Let's see. Remove. There we go. I don't know if we're live or not live. I think we are.
It
It's
looks
giving,
like we are. It says live for me. Yes.
it's giving me like 100 notifications on the stream. Anyway, hello. Welcome back. Welcome back to Open Room. It is the first one of the year, and really, really excited to be kicking it off with Ponima. We have been trying to have this conversation for, I don't know, a couple of months. And I can't even believe we're at the end of January, but finally we're here. The technology is working. We're on two different sides of the planet with one huge amount of shared passion. So thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited about this conversation. And maybe it was a blessing in disguise to have this conversation now because there's so much going on in the world. So I think maybe just aligning calendars and it was meant to be. Yeah.
I believe that. I always do. I always believe that you end up speaking to people exactly when you are meant to speak to them, right? You meet people when you're meant to meet them. So I'm really happy you're here. And for anyone that's tuning in, as you know, please engage, ask us questions. We will make this as interactive as possible. But let's start with what you just referenced there, Purnima, which is that the world has changed. I mean, I feel that the world never stops changing, but certainly in the last 10 days, we've had a lot of shift. You are very well known for your work in D&I. And of course, there is endless debate and conversation about what the future holds. I know you're over in Copenhagen. You have clients everywhere. What's your opinion? What is going on in the world? And what does this mean for our empathy, for our diversity and inclusion, for all of us?
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot to say about this, of course, Mimi. And the thing is that, it's in some ways it bothers me a lot that what happens in one part of the world has such an impact on other parts of the world. But that's the interconnected nature of the world that we live in. I mean, we saw that during COVID, and we're seeing it again when it comes to policies that are enacted or removed at federal level and what's happening in the US right now. And when you see that kind of policy shift as well. And of course, it has an impact. I think the good thing is that what I'm seeing is that companies outside the US are having robust conversations about how to continue to do the work, which is really encouraging despite this backlash that we're seeing. But I also think we really need to nuance the backlash. I think, we live in a world where we're so dependent on social media and what the headlines tell us about what's going on in the world. And I think, when you look at the data and you look a little bit more into what's happening, the good thing is that even in corporate America, despite what the headlines tell us, it's a handful of companies that are obviously backtracking on it. But I think the latest data that I saw was it is about 15 companies in the US out of the Fortune 500 that are really openly backtracking on it. And even then, even amongst them, if you start looking into their statements that they're making, I'm not necessarily sure they're completely disbanding DI, but rather that they're pivoting into looking at inclusion, into looking at belonging, into embedding DI practices and principles in processes and systems. And in some ways, I see that as a good shift. I think there's been a lot of performative work when it comes to DI, having the DI function maybe not even well resourced, but just having that sitting within people and culture, or even on its own. So I actually think this might be a really nice shift, a pivot point to companies actually going into, even if they're going into stealth mode, quietly doing it to not attract the attention of, Robbie Starbuck and the likes of. I do think that that's may not be a good thing. So I think we do need to have more nuanced conversations. We need to put in a bit more effort than looking at the headlines to really see what companies are doing. Of course, those that are openly coming out and supporting, whether it's JP Morgan, whether it's Costco, whether it's Apple, that's great. We do need leaders to step up and to, show the pathway forward, that there is a pathway sticking to the principles of DI, that it's good for business, it's good for employee well-being. Everyone wants to feel like they belong. Everyone wants to be valued for their uniqueness and differences. And everyone wants to work in an environment that is fair. Everyone wants to be hired and promoted through fair processes. And if we come down to the core of that, right, which is what diversity, equity, inclusion is about, everyone wants that. And I think that relates very much into a lot of the work that you're doing, Mimi, into thinking about belonging, into connection, into empathy, into addressing some of the issues that we have in the world around loneliness even.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I really appreciate your optimism. I believe so much that we need it, right? We need exactly what you just said. We need people to be able to look at some of these big shifts, whether it's in D&I or anything else in our world, and just say, hang on a minute, this could be a good thing. You know, it seems difficult. It seems like a really big shift. It seems really unfair, you know, is what I hear from so many people. It's just so unfair, Mimi. So I really appreciate that sort of different lens on looking at that there are other ways into that. And I really appreciate that statistic you had there around, you know, maybe this is about 15 companies out of 500, which, let's be honest, is actually out of tens of thousands, you know, so it is a small amount of people. So let's talk a little bit about that connection. And a little bit maybe just around linguistics, because as you said, you know, maybe organizations are shifting to inclusion when it was previously diversity and inclusion. Do you believe that a lot of this is about linguistics? And do you believe that if not, our connection in the workplace is going to suffer? Do you think that is that an impact of this? Because as we know, we already have 52% of the world feeling lonely. Do you think this is going to, I don't know, increase, decrease, have an impact on our connection?
Yeah. So, you know, talking about linguistics, and I've spent a lot of time over the last, few weeks really thinking about language and how the words that we use, the acronyms that we use, what an impact it has around how we approach a topic. Now, with an acronym like DEI, it's become easy for people to say, I'm anti-DEI, I'm anti-woke, because it sounds okay to say that. But the reality is that people don't understand necessarily. I think there are, of course, lots of people who do, who work in the space or advocating for this, who are inclusive leaders who understand it. But clearly, there are lots of people who don't. And it's easy when it comes to language to throw out that I'm anti-DEI. You know, so just coming back to my definitions that I shared earlier, you know, would we be able as a society to say that we're anti-uniqueness, valuing uniqueness and difference? Would we be able to say that we are anti-fairness? Would we be able to say that we're anti-belonging? I really find it hard to imagine that the vast majority of people would be able to say that. Maybe I'm naive. I am a realistic optimist, and I'd like to think that the glass is half full. That's how I look at the world. Otherwise, I think it's very hard to do this work. If you, to some extent, you have to have that optimism. But I do think that coming down to the core, and when we think about how much of the population is going through this loneliness epidemic, you know, when we show up at work, we want to feel like we belong. We want to be valued. We want to be respected. We want to feel that connection with other people. And at the core of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is about that. It is about nurturing workplace environments, societal community environments where everybody is able to show up. And we've unfortunately created this narrative around DI being only for some groups, benefiting some groups and not others. But actually, if diversity, equity, inclusion are done right, it levels the playing field. Everyone has those fair opportunities. And once you're in the organization, you have an opportunity to thrive and be recognized for who you are. And I don't know if there's anyone in the world who doesn't want that. I find it hard to believe. I'd love to be challenged on this. So bring it on. But I find that very hard to believe. So if we are focusing on that, I think there's so much of the loneliness epidemic that we're seeing, even in young boys, young men, that we're seeing, that we actually, a lot of what we're doing in DI, when done right, I do think, I mean, just to put it on the table, I do think there are some DI practices and narratives that unfortunately has got us to where we are now, where it's created the polarization, it's created the us and them, it has been performative, it hasn't addressed the systemic and the cultural changes that are necessary. But if we do it right, I do think we have an opportunity in our education systems, whether it's in early education, in primary, secondary, in tertiary education, and then in our workplaces, to really nurture environments where everyone feels that they belong, everyone feels that they are valued, and that would address some of that loneliness that we're seeing, so that people can make those connections with others.
I mean, I think it's so powerful what you say there around, when you ask that question and you say, is there anybody that doesn't want that? Because the answer is no, unless you are in the very, very small percentage of the human planet that sits within the narcissist traits, right? You're very happy to be on your own, doing your own thing. As human beings, we are a pro-social species. We need to be together. And I think your question there, and I love how you say, I'm open to be challenged on it. I challenge anyone to find a challenge with it, to be honest. What I want to sort of just shift a tiny bit, obviously within the same sphere, just to the word allyship, because that was, I believe, your second book, if I'm right with your order of your three books. I love that word. I don't know that word. I feel like maybe it's an American word, but maybe it's not. But why did you choose it? And what does it mean?
Yeah. I love the word allyship, clearly, obviously, and that's why I chose it. Of course, the term ally, you could say, comes from the military context, right? And most of us, I think, even in today's world, with the world we're living in, that's where our mind would go to. The connections that we make would go there. But actually, the concept of allyship comes from the late 1960s in the US. So it comes out of that context when cisgendered heterosexual individuals were seen as allies to the LGBTQ plus community during the Stonewall Inn riots. And that's where the idea of allyship actually comes from. Now, that was a while ago, and the word has kind of stayed under the radar. And I would argue in the last about 5 to 8 years is when we've seen the resurgence of the concept of allyship. And so in my book, The Art of Active Allyship, I define allyship as the lifelong process of building and nurturing supporting relationships with people from underrepresented, marginalized, and discriminated groups with the intention of advancing inclusion. That's how I choose to define it. Now, I also am very clear in the book that allyship is a verb, and so it's about behaviors, which also means that there's a range of behaviors. You have people in it, and I categorize it into three categories of behaviors. You have those who are in denial, that they don't believe that DI is necessary. We see a lot of them today. They feel that this is against them and their space and their advantages that they've held. And so you have those who are in denial. Then you have the vast majority of us who are actually passive allies. We might intellectually, maybe even morally, believe that diversity, equity, inclusion is the right thing to do. It's necessary for our organizations to thrive, but we may not necessarily know how to show up as an ally. And within this space, in today's context, I would argue that there's a lot of fear around how do we show up. And in fact, my research over the last 2 years has been looking into the backlash and resistance and this core emotion of fear and how to let go of that fear, and which is coming out in my new book in spring this year. And the title of that book is Can I Say That? Right? And that is what we feel, right?
Yes.
So for those who are passive, there is this intellectual understanding that I should do something. There's maybe even an emotional desire to want to do something, but we can't translate that intellectual and emotional desire into actions. And that's when we move into what I call active allyship. And that is where we stop being the bystander, we stop being passive, and we're really moving into engaging in frequent and consistent behaviors. So not the performative behaviors. So as I write in the book, by all means attend the annual International Women's Day event that's coming up in a few weeks. Attend your Pride parades, sure. But it's what you do in between the annual events that really matters. So it's the day-to-day consistent behaviors. And that's what I write about, the 7 behaviors in the book that really help people move that along. And a lot of it starts with introspection. I mean, the first 3 behaviors I have is really about self-work, because you can't show up as an ally until and unless you're simultaneously at least doing that self-work.
Yeah, in my work, I always say, self-empathy before empathy, because if you don't understand yourself, how are you ever going to really openly understand someone else? And how are you going to know that your perceived understanding of others is in fact not based in bias, which I know is, in the title of your new book as well, which is how do we overcome that? And I'm really happy that the title of your new book is Can I Say That? Because even for me, and I work in empathy, I do this every day. I work in the D&I space. Yeah. When I travel to other places, far from the cultures I work in most of the time, which tends to be the US and the UK, which is ironic because I came from the UK, and you would think that there's quite a lot of similarities. My sister obviously is also British, but I've been gone a long time, and I'm constantly asking her, how do I say that here? I just don't want to get it wrong. I don't want ever to say something that in the Middle East or India and Asia Pacific is totally fine. But I think that D&I reality, the link we talked about, linguistics, the acceptance of different ways of being that ally have different all around the world. I feel that in Asia, which is a very collectivist, very hospitality driven culture, it's for me, my opinion, right? But it's far easier to be an ally. People want to connect with other people. They want to include you. They want to bring you in. I feel my feeling is there's more acceptance of that. Whereas in some of those Western markets, again, my perception, I feel there's so much judgment around how you show up as an ally or how you speak or the things you say, that perhaps that makes it harder in the corporate world to be an ally to others. Do you think that's, I mean, is my feeling at all reflected in others, or is that just me?
Yeah, and this is something that I write about, that it is also culturally and contextually based. The idea of allyship is not something, while in the book, of course, I provide these 7 behaviors and some more general ways, or that it works across cultural contexts. I think it's also very, very important to understand your local culture, understand what works. But that's also what in some ways makes it more challenging, because that's when people really hesitate, right? Because showing up as an active ally means that I need to now put in all this effort to find out about my local context. I need to find out about what works here and what doesn't. But the thing is, we definitely should put in that effort, but there are also going to be times when we're going to get it wrong. And I think that is where grace comes in. Grace from other people around us. And I think that in today's world, there's just so much polarization that we're constantly looking to fault people for where they go wrong, rather than say that, hey, what you said the other day, and that's what I talk about as my 4th behavior in the 2nd book, is empathetic engagement. The other day you asked this question, perhaps in this cultural context, it could be phrased differently, or there's cultural nuances here that I'd love to share with you that might help you understand this, how to approach this better so you're more effective. I mean, there are ways to approach these conversations that create dialogue, that create discussion, but instead we're very quick to point fingers at others and say what they've done wrong, rather than allowing for that empathy, allowing for that grace, that we're not always going to get it right. We're not always going to know what is the right thing or the wrong thing to say and do, but that's part of the journey of learning and growing.
It is. And so often I feel that it's just about, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the word vulnerability because, first of all, it's trending and I'm not sure we know what it means. And second of all, I feel that it puts people off because really cognitively, do I want to do something that makes me vulnerable? Like vulnerability in the brain means, I'm at risk, my life's at risk. Having said that, even though I'm not a fan of the word, I do think you have to be a little bit vulnerable to have those conversations and to say to people, can you help me understand this, right? I often say to my audiences, when you name an emotion in a room, it diminishes. So if you don't know how to address someone, ask them, right? Because empathy is reciprocal, right?
Exactly. How do you
Rashana,
pronounce your name? What are your, your pronouns that you use? I mean, I think we need to allow that space for these conversations, not to make assumptions. And, I just think that a little bit more grace would go a long way in establishing connection, establishing that sense of belonging for people as well.
Yeah. And I think, connection itself, and this is what Rashana is asking us here, connection itself is clearly very multifaceted. We have this question, can you share your definition of it? I'd love to hear. Which really sort of opens my mind to think, yes, actually, there are so many different ways to connect. What do you think? What does that mean to you?
I mean, connection is not particularly a word that I have looked into the research definition. Of course, I'm a researcher, so I'm always going to ground it in that, right? So, it's also, I guess, I'm now going to share from what I believe it is, rather than a more theoretical definition around connection. And I'm sure there's plenty of work that's done around defining what connection is. And Mimi, I think this is more your area, so please do chime in with what's out there. I think for me, connection is really feeling that sense of belonging in that environment, being heard, respected, feeling that I'm seen.
Yeah,
I feel like that's a big part of connection, that when when I feel connected with someone, I feel that I am seen, and I feel that I am then making the efforts to ensure that the other person feels seen. And then you just know, I guess in many ways there is this emotional aspect to this, that you just know that you have that connection. And we all know when we're in a conversation with someone, that we know that immediately there isn't that connection, that there is a very different view, or that you don't feel that you're being respected or heard or seen in that dynamic. Whereas when that exists, you just know. It is that very subtle. Um, but for me, it's being seen is how I would look at it. But what about you, Mimi? Because I'm really curious now to hear from you, because this is your area.
Look, I think, I mean, again, I'm not one for sort of digging into realms of research to make definitions, but I think your definition is perfect. I think to connect is to be human. It is to have a relationship. It is to feel seen. And I wouldn't, for Roshana, but also for the audience listening, I wouldn't be scared of connection. Yes, you can have deep, meaningful, long-standing, trust-built connections in the workplace, but you can also connect with the Uber driver or the person who's helped you with your coffee today. And for me, those micro moments of connection are so critical in the healing that the world needs to do. You have, Purnima, your work, you are committing every day fundamentally to make the world more inclusive, right? Mm-hmm. To pull us together, to overcome gaps. But how many of those gaps we can't solve, in the FTSE 100 or the Fortune 500 anyway, because they're happening on the street. They're happening in your day-to-day life. So for me, that connection, I love what you said. It's about being seen. It's about creating a moment between people where they are recognized, they are acknowledged. So I think, thank you for the question. I think it's a really, really good one.
I think it's a great question. And I have the best conversations with taxi drivers, when I'm in different cities around the world, and, you hop into a taxi at the airport, and oh my gosh, I actually think that those are some of the best connections you make, and they don't last, of course. They're just in that moment, but you have the richest conversations about politics, about culture, about society, about raising a family, about their backgrounds, and some of them with rich educational backgrounds, unable to find work in a certain context, and just all of those things. I think they bring human beings together, and I think it's just incredible to see that. So thank you, Rachna, for that question.
Yeah, and someone else here saying connection can be implicit in that it happens between our nervous systems when we come together as humans, whether we want it or not. So I'm not sure about the whether we want it or not part necessarily. However, that is a part of neural mirroring. So you're absolutely right. Exactly. I don't have your name to address you there, but that we connect on a physiological level. That does actually make us human. And I'm watching the clock. I know we don't have I could stay all day, but talking of Uber drivers, taxi drivers, I'm going to use something I heard in an Uber recently to frame the next question here from me. I was in Australia recently, and I was in an Uber, like you, from the airport, long conversation. And the gentleman said to me, well, my biggest piece of advice for you, because I asked him what it would be, is never sit on the wall. And I was like, you need to tell me a little bit about what you mean by that. And he said, well, we have so many problems in the world, but you can't be in the middle. You have to choose. You have to be in or out, or for or pro, or with or without. Never sit on the wall. He said, he was an elderly gentleman. He said, in all my life, I've never seen anybody reach great success from sitting on the wall. So, Purnima, how do we get off the wall? It's a very disconcerting time out there. People are looking to you, your books, your content, I'm sure, for tips and advice. How do we navigate this? How do we get off the wall and really lean into some of the change our world needs?
Yeah, I've done a few media engagements over the past, as you can imagine, with everything happening with DI, and my message has been the same throughout, and it will continue to be for a while. Speak up. Please speak up. This is not the time to be the bystander, to be apathetic about what's happening in the world. I think there's, for far too long, there have been too many of us who have been passive, who have just not stepped up, who have just continued to say, oh, well, yeah, okay, there's these dissenting voices, there's the right wing, and all right, but this is not the time to do that. We can see that these voices have now got power, and the power is now resulting in consequences that are real for people. There are consequences to the LGBTQ plus community in the US that is real. It is not something that is showing up on a headline somewhere. It is day-to-day existence for people. This is not the time for any of us to be sitting on the fence. We have to take a stand. Hopefully the stand is to support our fellow human beings to be able to show up as they are, to live their lives that they want to live. But please speak up in whatever circles of influence. You don't have to be on LinkedIn making a big splash. For some, that's not comfortable. Within your own spheres of influence, challenge at the dining table, challenge by lunch and the coffee machine at work, and I don't mean in an aggressive way, but just empathetic engagement, the fourth behavior in my book. Ask questions, asking the right questions in the right tone, engaging with people. And yes, I am asking people to be vulnerable in some ways, because I understand the hesitation with using the word, but at the end of the day, we don't know all the answers. We don't have all the answers. We don't know what the right pathway is. We're living in very uncertain times, but we have to engage. We don't know how the other person's going to react. I understand that, but at the same time, we have to engage. We have to speak up. We have to speak up on behalf of those who may not be able to do so. We have to speak up for those who may not necessarily have the voice, platform, energy. Right? I mean, can you imagine if your identity is being challenged to such a large extent? Do you have the mental capacity, energy? I would say I would not even blame people if they couldn't fight for an advocate for themselves. And that's where we come in. That's where active allyship comes in. For those of us who can, we have to speak up. We have to advocate.
I mean, I love that. And I think, if there's anyone listening to us that feels that they are in the group of people for whatever reason that can't speak up, that, are struggling with disconnection, with loneliness, perhaps with exclusion, what's your advice to them? We've spoken about the people that can speak up, do it more.
Yep.
But if you're feeling that you can't, what's your advice? What do they do? Where do they go? Who do they talk to?
Yeah, I think reach out to there are community groups. I mean, I've seen so much of them actually on social media, various platforms, with groups, help groups, support groups that are coming together to support the groups, especially in the US right now. I would argue that it's in other parts of the world, but right now the intensity is definitely in the US, who are really feeling threatened, right, by what's happened, by the executive orders. And I think there are groups. Seek help, find your community, know that you're not alone. And I think my message is to them is you're not alone. There are people out there who really want, who do not believe in this, who definitely want to support, but find your group where you feel safe. I think right now there's a lot of feeling unsafe. Find a group where you feel safe, and please do self-care. So if you're not feeling up for speaking up, that's okay. I understand that. Find your group, find space where you feel cared for. Use helplines, speak to others who can provide that kind of support. And for the rest of us who are not in that situation, let's do the work. Now's the time to do the work. If you've been sitting on the fence, please join me. Let's try and do the work. I don't know if I'm doing enough, or I feel like there's always room to be doing more. So I'm looking for opportunities to do more, to advocate more as well.
Mm-hmm. And there is, like you said, so much to be done. I just want to quickly check if there's any questions here that pertain to this very last point, but they're all slightly back on the connection point, so I'm going to leave them for now. But Purnima, thank you for coming, and for everyone that tuned in, thank you for being part of it. As Purnima was just saying, there has never been a time when we need your empathy and your action. But I think it starts with the empathy, to understand the reality of others, to understand that not everyone is perhaps in your situation or able to speak as you are. And please use it. As Purnima very clearly just told us, there's never been a time when we need it more, especially if you are in the USA. So it's been a pleasure. It always goes fast, but I feel this one went faster than fast, right?
It was such a great conversation. Thank you so much.
I must be respectful. I must finish on time. But I hope that we can do a little bit more. I think there is so much crossover between your work, which is more in that action space, and my work, which is potentially in the understanding to get to that action. It seems to me that there's never been a time that we need all of these things more than now, right?
Absolutely.
Allyship, connection, empathy, integration, inclusion, all of these things. And as far as I see it, it doesn't matter what the government of any country does, right? Because the people are what make up a country. And together we can create change, and we will create change, and we will continue to do that work. So thank you for being here and, just for inspiring us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Mimi. And thank you to everyone who joined as well.
Have a really lovely day, and I'll speak to you really soon.
Bye.
Bye. There we go. The button's not working very well today.